I felt a cold shift in the very walls of my own home, a quiet suffocation creeping into the spaces I had built with my bare hands. So I packed a bag, handed over my spare keys, and lied, telling them I was catching a bus out of state. But I never left. I parked 2 blocks down, watching my own driveway from the freezing shadows. That was when my elderly neighbor tapped on my frost-covered window. "Wait until midnight, Ronald," he whispered, his eyes wide with a sick knowing. "You will see everything." When the dashboard clock finally struck 12, the breath left my lungs. What pulled up to my house was not a secret lover or a debt collector, but something so monstrous it shattered 40 years of a father's love in a single heartbeat. Before I share what I uncovered in the dark, let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart the very people who were supposed to protect you. I zipped up the heavy canvas of my old duffel bag, the rough material scraping against calloused hands that had spent 4 decades wrestling with industrial lathes and steel grinders. 40 years of inhaling metallic dust, coming home with grease permanently embedded in my fingerprints, all to pay off the mortgage on this 2-story brick house in suburban Illinois. It was supposed to be my sanctuary, a place where I could comfortably spend my twilight years surrounded by the memories of my late wife. Instead, it had slowly transformed into a waiting room for my own demise. I walked down the carpeted stairs, each step creaking with familiar memories, and found my son Christopher and his wife Megan sitting at my kitchen island. They were sipping lattes out of my late wife's ceramic mugs, whispering in hushed, urgent tones that immediately died the second my heavy boots hit the linoleum floor. I slid my spare brass key across the granite countertop. It stopped right in front of Christopher. I told them I was taking the Greyhound down to Ohio to visit my sister Susan for a week. I said I needed a change of scenery, some fresh air, a break from the neighborhood. Christopher did not even look up from his glowing phone screen. He just muttered a flat "safe travels," sliding the key into his pocket, with a greedy eagerness that made my stomach churn. Megan offered a tight plastic smile, telling me to rest my tired mind. Her voice dripped with the kind of condescending pity you reserve for a dying shelter dog, not a grown man who still chopped his own firewood. I walked out the front door, the frosty autumn wind hitting my face, but I did not head for the bus station. I never bought a ticket. The truth was I was being suffocated in my own home, and I desperately needed to know why. It started small a few months ago. Things going missing. I would find my monthly bank statements ripped to shreds at the bottom of the recycling bin before I even had the chance to open the mail. I would catch Megan pacing the perimeter of the backyard, writing down property dimensions in a small leather notebook, stopping abruptly whenever she saw me watching from the porch. Then came the blatant disrespect. They stopped asking if they could use my car, simply taking it and leaving it on empty. They moved my personal filing cabinets into the damp corner of the basement, claiming I was hoarding junk in the study. Whenever I tried to bring it up, Christopher would sigh heavily, pinch the bridge of his nose, and tell me I was getting forgetful. He would say, "Dad, we already talked about this. Your memory is slipping again. It is for your own good." But my memory was razor sharp. I knew exactly where I placed my things, and I knew the distinct difference between natural aging and deliberate gaslighting. They were treating me like an expired battery, waiting for me to finally leak out and die so they could toss the shell and claim the device. I needed to see what they did when they thought the house was empty. I circled back around the neighborhood as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the suburban streets in shades of bleak gray and deep blue. I parked my rusting Ford Explorer 2 blocks down the street, wedged tightly between a massive oak tree and a broken street lamp. The shadows swallowed the car whole. I turned off the engine, pulled my heavy wool coat tight around my chest, and waited. The cold seeped through the floorboards, biting at my knees, but the icy dread expanding in my chest was far worse. Hours crawled by. I watched the neighborhood lights click off one by one, families settling into the safety of their night routines. My house sat at the end of the cul-de-sac, completely dark, except for the warm yellow glow spilling from the kitchen window. I drank tepid coffee from a thermos, rubbing my stiff hands together to keep the blood flowing. At 1:45, a sharp tap on my passenger side window made me jump. I rolled the glass down an inch, my heart hammering against my ribs. It was Mr. Peterson, my 80-year-old neighbor from across the street. He was wearing a thick bathrobe, his breath pluming in the freezing air. He did not ask why I was sitting in a freezing car in the dark. He just leaned in close, his eyes darting nervously toward my house. "Wait until midnight, Ronald." He whispered, his voice trembling with a sick, heavy knowing. "Just wait. You will see everything." He turned and shuffled back into the shadows of his own yard, leaving me alone with the ticking dashboard clock. The green digital numbers on the dash flipped to 12. Exactly at midnight, the quiet hum of an engine broke the neighborhood silence. A sleek, unmarked black van turned the corner, its headlights killed, rolling to a slow, stealthy stop right in my driveway. The side door slid open, and a tall, thin man stepped out into the freezing night. He was wearing a dark trench coat and carrying a heavy black medical bag. Before he even reached the porch, my front door swung wide open. Christopher and Megan rushed out, practically tripping over themselves to greet him. There were no polite introductions. Christopher grabbed the man by the elbow and ushered him urgently through the front door, Megan looking nervously up and down the street before shutting it tight behind them. I did not think. I just moved. I slipped out of my truck, keeping low to the frozen grass, my dark coat blending into the moonless night. I crept through the side gate I had built by hand 30 years ago, knowing exactly which hinges squeaked and which ones were silent. I pressed my back against the brick siding and crouched directly beneath the slightly cracked kitchen window. The voices drifted out, sharp and frantic. I recognized Christopher's voice first, laced with that familiar, desperate panic he only ever used when he was asking me for money. "I need this done tonight," Evans, Christopher hissed. "The final notice for the loans came today. If the shell company collapses, they take the cars, they take Megan's boutique, they take everything. I am drowning here. I cannot wait another month for nature to take its course. We need to liquidate this house now." I pressed my hand against my mouth to stop the gasp from escaping. Christopher was bankrupt. He had spent his entire adult life bouncing from one failed, flashy venture to the next, always coming to me for bailouts. I had cut him off a year ago, telling him he needed to stand on his own 2 feet. I never imagined his solution to standing on his own feet was to cut off my legs. The man with the medical bag. His voice was smooth, detached, utterly void of any medical oath he had once sworn. "I have the prescriptions right here," he said, the sound of glass vials clinking softly against the granite counter. "But you have to follow the protocol exactly. If we dose him right, the heavy sedatives will build up in his system over the next 48 hours. It will mimic severe cognitive decline, loss of motor function, inability to form coherent sentences, intense confusion. By Friday, when I come back for the official evaluation, his state will be undeniable." Megan chimed in, her voice dripping with greedy anticipation. "And then what? How fast can we get the paperwork through the courts? How fast can we get him out of the master bedroom?" Dr. Evans chuckled, a dry, soulless sound. "I will sign the advanced dementia certification on Friday evening. With my medical backing, a judge will grant you emergency financial and medical power of attorney by Monday morning. You take the estate. You clear your debts, and the state will physically drag him to the county ward for his own safety. You will not even have to pack his bags. Once he is locked in the psychiatric wing, anything he says about being poisoned will be written off as paranoid dementia. It is a foolproof system." The air vanished from my lungs. The cold night wind whipped around me, but I could not feel my face or my hands. The son I had rocked to sleep, the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle in this very driveway, the man whose wedding I had paid for with my retirement savings, was standing 10 feet away from me, purchasing the chemical destruction of my mind. They were not just stealing my home. They were going to strip me of my sanity, pump my veins full of antipsychotics, and lock me in a desolate county ward to rot among strangers. I heard the sound of paper tearing, likely a check being written. Friday night, Christopher said, his voice dropping an octave, cold and resolute. We are hosting a family wellness dinner. You show up, you sign the papers, and I write you the second half of this payment. The old man will be a drooling vegetable by then. I backed away from the window, my knees buckling slightly as the weight of their treachery crashed down on my shoulders. I stumbled through the dark yard, my vision blurring my chest, heaving with silent, ragged breaths. I did not realize I was crying until the tears froze against my cheeks. I retreated to the icy sanctuary of my Ford Explorer. The heater was broken, but I did not care. I sat in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. A violent, searing rage erupted in my gut. I wanted to march back up that driveway, kick the heavy oak door off its hinges, and drag the three of them out into the street. I wanted to scream until my vocal cords shredded, to demand how my own flesh and blood could look at me and see nothing but a slaughterhouse payout. My hand hovered over the door handle. But then the cold logic of survival, honed by 40 years of fixing broken complex machinery, took over. If I burst in there now, what would happen? They would panic, yes. But Christopher was a smooth talker, and Evans was a licensed physician. They would deny everything. They would flush the sedatives down the toilet, claim I was having a paranoid episode, and call the police to report a mentally unstable old man having a violent outburst. Confronting them in the heat of my anger would only hand them the exact narrative they needed to lock me away tonight. I pulled my hand back. I closed my eyes and let the agonizing reality wash over me, allowing the burning grief to cool and harden into a focused, unbreakable resolve. I could not fight them with emotion. I had to annihilate them with strategy. I sat in the freezing car for hours, watching the black van eventually roll out of my driveway and disappear into the night. My mind raced, mapping out every angle, every vulnerability, every legal loophole I could exploit. I realized that my silence was my greatest weapon. They thought I was naive, trusting, and slow. I would give them exactly the victim they expected. I would walk right back into the lion's den, knowing the jaws were waiting to snap shut, and I would let them think they were winning right up until the moment I pulled the floor out from under them. As the first pale rays of dawn began to crack the horizon, painting the frozen suburban streets in a bleak gray light, I finalized my tactical plan. I would return to the house. I would pretend my trip was canceled due to a sudden illness on my sister's end. I would look my son in the eye. I would smile at my daughter-in-law, and I would let them try to poison me. The game had fundamentally shifted. It was no longer about saving my relationship with my son. My son had died the moment he handed over that check. This was about absolute survival. I started the engine, the old motor roaring to life in the quiet dawn, and drove the 2 blocks back to my driveway, ready to begin the war they had started. The icy morning air whipped across my face as I stepped out of my rusted truck. It was exactly 6 in the morning. The neighborhood was dead silent, and the frost crunched beneath my heavy work boots. I walked up my own driveway, not as a father, returning home, but as a soldier entering enemy territory. My keys jingled as I slipped the brass into the front door deadbolt. I turned the lock with a loud, heavy click and pushed the solid oak door open, letting it slam shut behind me to make as much noise as possible. I stomped my boots on the welcome mat and called out into the quiet house. I yelled that I was back early. I announced that my sister Susan had caught a terrible stomach flu and I had to take a rideshare back to avoid getting sick myself. The response was immediate and chaotic. I heard a loud metallic crash from the kitchen, followed by the frantic scrambling of feet. I walked down the hallway and saw my daughter-in-law Megan, freezing like a deer caught in headlights. She was standing by the kitchen island holding a small glass vial. Her face turned completely white, and her eyes darted wildly toward the stairs. She shoved the vial deep into her robe pocket and forced her facial muscles to contort into a sickeningly sweet smile. Her performance was so flawless and terrifying that it made my stomach turn. She hurried over to me with outstretched arms. She told me I startled her, and she asked why I did not call them to pick me up. Her voice dripped with that fake, sugary concern she always used when she wanted something from me. I kept my face perfectly blank and told her my phone battery had died. I played the part of the tired and confused old man, perfectly letting my shoulders slump and my hands tremble just a little bit to sell the illusion. Megan linked her arm through mine and guided me toward the kitchen stool. She insisted I sit down because I looked absolutely exhausted from the cold journey. She moved to the coffee maker and poured a large mug of dark roast coffee. I watched her back as she stood there for a few seconds too long, making subtle movements with her hands. She brought the steaming ceramic mug over and slid it across the granite counter right into my hands. She told me to drink up and warm my bones. She added that she had even stirred in that new memory vitamin the doctor had recommended for my declining health. I stared at the dark liquid swirling in the mug. The steam rose up, carrying the bitter scent of roasted beans mixed with something faintly chemical and unnatural. I knew exactly what was in that cup. The lethal heavy sedatives the fake doctor had prescribed just 6 hours ago at midnight. If I took even one sip, my mind would begin to slip away. My motor functions would fail, and I would hand them the exact medical evidence they needed to lock me in a county psychiatric ward by Friday. Before I could even pretend to lift the mug to my lips, the heavy thud of footsteps echoed from the upstairs hallway. My son Christopher marched down the wooden staircase. His face was flushed with exertion, and his jaw was set in a tight, cruel line. He was carrying a massive stack of cardboard boxes. They were my cardboard boxes, the ones I kept in the study filled with the photo albums of my late wife and my old machining tools. Christopher dropped the heavy boxes onto the hardwood floor with a loud, careless thud. He did not ask how my trip was. He did not welcome me back to the house I had paid for with 40 years of back-breaking labor. He just stood there, crossing his arms over his chest, and looked at me with an expression of pure, cold calculation. He told me we needed to have a serious conversation about my declining health. His voice was completely devoid of any warmth or familial love. It was the voice of a greedy businessman liquidating a worthless asset. He said my mind was slipping too fast, and it was no longer safe for me to be alone in the main areas of the house. I sat there gripping the warm mug of poisoned coffee, playing the role of the bewildered elderly father. I asked him what he meant by that statement. Christopher did not hesitate for a single second. He informed me that the parents of Megan, Paul, and Diane were packing up their apartment this very morning. He said they were moving into my master bedroom by the end of the day. He claimed they were moving in to help manage my worsening dementia and provide round-the-clock supervision. He spoke to me as if I was already a ghost, as if I had no say in what happened under my own roof. Megan stepped up beside him, nodding in agreement. She patted my shoulder and told me her parents were so generous to give up their space to come take care of me. She said it was the only way to keep me out of a nursing home for as long as possible. The sheer audacity of their lies was suffocating. I knew Paul and Diane had recently gone completely bankrupt. I knew they were losing their rented apartment and needed a place to live. Christopher was using my fake illness as a convenient excuse to move his destitute in-laws into my master suite while plotting to steal my entire estate to clear his own massive debts. Christopher kicked one of the cardboard boxes toward the basement door. He told me I was taking this basement. He said they had already moved my bed down there next to the old furnace. He coldly explained that there were no stairs for me to fall down in the basement, and it would be much safer for everyone if I stayed down there out of the way. They were permanently banishing me to the cold concrete underground of my own home. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to stand up and hurl that poisoned coffee directly into his arrogant face. I wanted to grab him by the collar and throw him out the front door into the freezing snow. But the cold, tactical logic of survival kept me anchored to the stool. If I exploded in anger, they would use it as proof of my mental instability. They would call the police and tell them I was having a violent dementia episode. I had to swallow my pride to win this war. I had to let them believe their sick plan was working perfectly. I lowered my head and stared at the dark coffee, letting my silence seal their fate. I did not argue with Christopher because arguing would mean I still saw him as my son and not the threat he had become. I let my shoulders droop even further and offered a weak nod. I lifted the warm ceramic mug toward my face, but right before the dark liquid touched my lips, I hunched over and forced a violent coughing fit. I doubled over, hacking and wheezing, turning my back to them as if I was trying to catch my breath. I stumbled toward the kitchen sink, leaning heavily against the counter. With my back completely blocking their view, I slipped my free hand into the deep pocket of my wool coat and pulled out the metal thermos I had brought with me. In one swift, silent motion, I poured almost all of the spiked coffee into the metal flask. I tossed the last few drops down the stainless steel drain and rinsed the mug under the cold tap. I capped the thermos tight and shoved it deep back into my pocket, pressing it against my ribs. When I turned back around, I let my eyelids droop. I dragged my feet across the linoleum floor, acting as if the exhaustion of the trip and the supposed medication were already clouding my brain. Megan watched me with a vulture-like intensity, her eyes tracking my every sluggish movement. She stepped aside and gestured toward the basement door. She told me to go down and rest, claiming they had set up everything perfectly for my comfort. I opened the basement door, and the stale, damp smell of the underground hit me instantly. I gripped the wooden handrail and began my slow descent. Each step groaned under my weight, echoing in the narrow stairwell. I heard the door click shut above me, followed immediately by the sound of the deadbolt sliding into place. They had locked me in. The basement was a cold concrete cavern where I had spent decades fixing broken things. Now it was designed to be my final resting place. The single exposed bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered, casting long, jagged shadows across the gray walls. I looked around and saw what they considered a comfortable setup. My old guest mattress had been shoved into the corner, right next to the rusted iron body of the furnace. A thin blanket was tossed carelessly over the bare mattress. There was no reading lamp and no nightstand. It was just the bare minimum required to keep a human body alive while its mind was supposedly erased. I walked past the makeshift bed and headed straight toward the back corner of the cellar. Behind stacks of old paint cans and holiday decorations stood my heavy steel filing cabinet. That cabinet was the financial vault of my entire life. Inside those metal drawers were the original blueprints of the house my late wife and I had designed, the birth certificates, the tax records, and most importantly, the original unencumbered property deed. That piece of paper was the only thing standing between my son and his complete takeover of my estate. But as I approached the cabinet, the dim light caught the gleam of solid brass. I stopped dead in my tracks. Wrapped tightly around the metal handles of the top drawer was a thick, heavy-duty steel chain secured by a massive brand-new padlock. The brass lock was pristine, completely free of the basement dust that coated everything else. Christopher had not just moved my things down here to clear space. He had actively locked down my most sensitive legal documents, knowing I would need them if I tried to fight back. He probably assumed an elderly man with a slipping mind would simply forget the combination or lack the physical strength to break a commercial-grade lock. He thought he had severed my access to my own identity. I reached out and ran my thumb over the cold brass of the padlock. The sheer arrogance of it made my blood run hot. They had orchestrated my medical demise, brought strangers into my bedroom, and locked my entire life behind a $20 piece of hardware from the local supply store. They thought I was a helpless old fool who would just lie down next to the furnace and wait for the state ward to come collect me. I let out a slow, steady breath and let the mask of the confused old man fall completely away. I was alone in the dark. There was no one left to perform for. I turned away from the locked cabinet and looked toward my old wooden workbench sitting in the shadows. The tools were covered in a fine layer of sawdust, but they were exactly where I had left them. I had spent 40 years working with steel and iron. A brass padlock was not a barrier. It was barely an inconvenience. I walked over to the pegboard and ran my hand along the familiar cold shapes of the tools. My fingers wrapped around the solid, heavy grip of my titanium crowbar. The metal was freezing against my palm, but it felt like an old friend. I pulled it down from the wall, feeling the balanced weight of it in my hand. I walked back toward the filing cabinet, stepping quietly on the concrete floor. The war had moved into my territory now. They had locked the door above me, but they forgot who built the foundation beneath their feet. The basement was not just a storage space to me. It was a museum of my labor. I looked at the rusted coffee cans filled with sorted screws and nails. I looked at the bandsaw I had bought secondhand when Christopher was just a toddler. I used to come down here to build wooden toys for him. I had sanded down rough edges so he would not get splinters. I had spent countless evenings breathing in wood glue and varnish, all to make sure my son had things other kids had. Now that same son was upstairs moving his bankrupt in-laws into my bedroom, while I stood in the dark holding a crowbar. The cold seeped through the soles of my boots. The furnace kicked on with a loud mechanical groan, blowing dry, dusty heat into the corner, but it did nothing to warm the chill in my bones. I stood in front of the filing cabinet and examined the chain. It was thick industrial steel, probably bought just days ago. Christopher was always lazy with his plans, but he was thorough when it came to securing a payout. He wanted to make sure there was absolutely no way I could access the deed before the fake doctor signed the commitment papers on Friday. I tightened my grip on the titanium bar, knowing exactly where to apply pressure. You do not spend a lifetime working as a machinist without learning the exact breaking point of every metal alloy. I wedged the flattened edge of the crowbar into the tight space between the brass lock body and the steel shackle. I took a deep breath, letting the stale basement air fill my lungs. I did not feel tired anymore. I did not feel old. I felt dangerous. I pushed down on the heavy iron bar with slow, deliberate force. I did not want to make a loud snapping noise that might echo through the floorboards and alert the vultures upstairs. I applied steady, increasing leverage, letting the mechanics of the tool do the work. The metal groaned in protest, emitting a quiet, high-pitched squeal of bending brass. I leaned my weight into it, pressing my forearm against the cold steel of the cabinet to muffle the sound. With a sudden sharp crack, the internal pins of the padlock shattered. The brass shackle popped free from the housing. I caught the heavy lock in my palm before it could hit the concrete floor and clatter. I slipped the broken pick into my pocket, right next to the thermos of poisoned coffee. I unspooled the heavy chain from the drawer handles and set it gently on the floor. I slid the top drawer open, hearing the metal runners squeak softly. Inside, the hanging green folders were packed tight, with decades of perfectly organized history. I ran my fingers over the plastic tabs until I found the one marked for property. I pulled the thick manila envelope out and opened the clasp. The original deed was right there, untouched. It was a simple piece of paper, but it was the anchor to my entire estate. I reached further back into the drawer and found a second folder completely hidden behind my old tax returns. It held the paperwork for an $800,000 life insurance policy. I had taken it out decades ago and recently cashed it out into an offshore trust. Christopher had spent hours searching for my assets, but he was too arrogant to look past the obvious checking accounts. He had no idea this money existed, and I was going to make sure he never saw a single penny of it. I folded the deed and the insurance papers carefully and tucked them into the inner breast pocket of my wool coat. I closed the metal drawer and pushed it firmly shut. I looked up at the ceiling where the floorboards creaked heavily above my head. Someone was walking directly over the basement, probably pacing the kitchen, while they unpacked their bags. I had the evidence and I had my documents, but I was still locked in an underground box. If I walked back up those stairs and demanded they unlock the door, the game would be over. I had to leave the house without them knowing I was gone. I turned my eyes toward the small, rectangular egress window tucked high up on the far concrete wall. I stood in the freezing shadows of the basement, with the broken padlock resting heavy in my palm. The titanium crowbar had done its job perfectly. 40 years of working with industrial metals had taught me exactly how much pressure was needed to snap solid brass without making a sound. I set the crowbar down on the dusty concrete floor and grabbed the handle of the top drawer of my filing cabinet. I pulled it open inch by inch, wincing at every tiny squeak the rusted metal tracks made in the dead silence of the cellar. My hands were shaking, but not from the cold. They were shaking with the adrenaline of a man who was dismantling a trap set by his own flesh and blood. I reached into the dark drawer, and my fingers brushed against a crisp, new manila envelope resting right at the very front. I had not put that there. I pulled it out into the dim, flickering light of the single overhead bulb and opened the metal clasp. Inside was a thick stack of freshly printed legal documents. The bold black letters at the top of the first page made the breath catch in my throat. It was a comprehensive declaration of medical and financial power of attorney. I read through the dense legal jargon, and every paragraph felt like a physical blow to my chest. Christopher had drafted a complete surrender of my human rights. The clauses explicitly granted him the absolute authority to liquidate my physical assets, to drain my checking accounts, and to authorize my involuntary commitment to a psychiatric facility. He had even typed out a section giving himself the power to sell this very house, the home I had built and paid for with my own sweat long before he was even born. He had left a blank line at the bottom for my signature, and another blank line for his fake doctor to sign as a medical witness. The sheer calculated cruelty of it was staggering. This was not a desperate last-minute decision made by a struggling son. This was a premeditated legal execution. I folded the terrible documents and shoved them deep into the inner pocket of my heavy wool coat. I refused to leave them there for him to use against me. Then I reached all the way to the very back of the deep metal drawer, pressing my hand against the cold steel panel. I felt for the tiny hidden latch I had installed over a decade ago. With a soft click, the false back panel dropped away, revealing a secret compartment Christopher knew absolutely nothing about. I pulled out a worn leather portfolio. Inside was my original, unencumbered property deed, proving that I owned the house outright with no liens or mortgages. But right behind the deed was something much more valuable. It was the complete paperwork for a life insurance policy worth $800,000. I had taken out that policy 30 years ago, when my wife was still alive, to ensure Christopher would always be taken care of if an accident happened at the machine shop. I had paid the hefty premiums every single month by working brutal double shifts and breathing in toxic metallic dust until my lungs burned. Christopher had spent the last few months tearing apart my home office looking for my assets, but he was too arrogant and impatient to look past my standard checking accounts. He assumed I was just a simple blue-collar worker with a modest pension. He expected a quick payout from selling the house. He had absolutely no idea about the massive life insurance policy, and what he certainly did not know was that just a few months ago, after I first started noticing his toxic behavior, I had quietly cashed out the entire policy and moved the funds into an impenetrable offshore trust. The money was completely safe and legally invisible. I gathered the deed and the insurance trust documents, holding them tight against my chest. These papers were my shield and my sword. I carefully tucked the leather portfolio into my coat pocket, right next to the forged power of attorney. I needed to leave the filing cabinet looking exactly as it had before I tampered with it. If Christopher came down here and saw the drawer hanging open, or the lock completely destroyed, my cover would be blown immediately. I pushed the heavy drawer closed until it clicked securely into place. I picked up the heavy steel chain and wrapped it back around the handles, just the way I had found it. I took the broken brass padlock and carefully aligned the snapped metal shackle back into the housing. From more than a few feet away, in the terrible basement lighting, it looked perfectly intact and completely secure. I wiped my hands on my jeans, trying to steady my racing heart. I had secured my identity and my assets. Now I needed to find a way out of this underground concrete box before they realized I had not consumed the heavy sedatives. I turned my eyes toward the small rectangular egress window tucked high up on the far wall near the ceiling. It was narrow and covered in cobwebs, but it led directly out to the side yard behind the bushes. I walked over to my old workbench and grabbed a sturdy wooden stool, dragging it quietly across the floor to position it under the window. Just as my boots touched the wooden rung of the stool, the heavy floorboards directly above my head let out a violent creak. My blood ran completely cold. Someone was walking across the kitchen floor right above me. The footsteps were heavy and deliberate, lacking the soft, careful tread of my daughter-in-law. It was Christopher. The footsteps moved steadily across the room and stopped right above the basement stairwell. I froze completely still, holding my breath in the darkness. A terrifying metallic click echoed down the wooden stairs. It was the sound of the heavy deadbolt being turned from the outside. The basement door groaned as it was pulled slowly open. A shaft of pale yellow light spilled down the wooden steps, cutting through the basement shadows. I heard Christopher call out my name. His voice echoed down the narrow stairwell. He asked if I was awake down there, but his tone held absolutely no genuine concern. It was cold and clinical. It was the voice of a predator checking a trap to see if the bait had been taken. I was coming down to verify that the poisoned coffee had paralyzed my motor functions and erased my mind. He was coming down to see if his father was finally broken enough to sign away his life. The wooden stairs began to creak one by one as he started his slow descent into the basement. The heavy thud of his boots grew louder and closer. I had nowhere to hide. There were no closets down here, and no dark corners deep enough to conceal a grown man. If he reached the bottom of the stairs and saw me standing perfectly lucid by the egress window with a coat full of legal documents, the entire war would end right here in the dark. I looked up at the frosted glass of the small window above me, knowing I had only seconds to pull myself up and squeeze through before the light from the stairwell exposed me entirely. I grabbed the edge of the concrete ledge and hoisted myself upward as the footsteps closed the distance. The wooden stool groaned beneath my heavy work boots as I reached up toward the frosted glass of the egress window. Dust fell into my eyes, but I could not blink. The heavy footfalls on the wooden stairs were deafening in the absolute silence of the basement. Christopher was descending slowly. He was taking his time, assuming I was already a paralyzed mess curled up next to the rusted furnace. I pressed my palms against the freezing metal latch of the window. It had been painted over years ago and was rusted shut from the damp underground air. I could hear the creak of the 5th step, then the 6th. He was halfway down. I shoved the heel of my hand against the stubborn latch, ignoring the sharp pain shooting up my wrist. I thought of the forged power of attorney resting against my chest and the poisoned coffee in my coat pocket. That terrifying realization gave me a sudden surge of strength. With a loud crack, the rusted metal gave way and the window swung inward. A blast of freezing morning air hit my face, carrying the sharp scent of dead leaves and winter frost. It was the smell of survival, but I was not out of the trap yet. I grabbed the rough concrete ledge and hoisted myself up. At 70 years old, my shoulders were broad and my joints ached with decades of hard labor. I shoved my head and my right arm through the narrow opening. The jagged concrete scraped harshly against my heavy wool coat. I had to contort my torso, twisting my ribs at a very painful angle to protect the metal thermos and the leather portfolio tucked inside my deep pockets. I heard the final heavy thud of Christopher stepping off the wooden staircase and onto the basement floor. "Dad." His voice echoed through the dark cellar. It was a cold, detached sound, completely devoid of any human empathy. "Are you awake down here?" I held my breath, biting down hard on my lower lip to keep from making a single sound. My waist was wedged tightly in the window frame. I kicked my legs off the wooden stool, scraping my boots against the concrete wall for leverage. Behind me, I heard the distinct click of a heavy flashlight turning on. A beam of harsh white light swept across the floor, illuminating the thick dust motes in the air. The bright beam hit the rusted furnace just inches below my dangling boots. I dug my fingers into the frozen dirt of the side yard outside and pulled with every ounce of strength I had left in my body. My hips popped through the narrow frame, and I tumbled forward out of the window. I crashed hard into the frozen bushes, scratching my face on the brittle branches. I lay perfectly still in the dirt, staring back down through the open window. Through the dirty glass, I saw Christopher walk into the corner. He shined his light directly on the empty mattress. I heard him curse angrily under his breath. I knew he would turn around and see the open window and the wooden stool in a matter of seconds. I rolled onto my stomach and scrambled to my feet. I did not have the lungs of a young man anymore, but fear and absolute rage are incredible fuel. I stumbled through the overgrown side gate, keeping my head very low behind the wooden fence. My breath plumed in the freezing air, forming white clouds of exhaustion as my boots hit the concrete sidewalk. I forced my aching legs to carry me down the empty suburban street. I did not look back. I knew Christopher was probably sprinting up the basement stairs right now to tell Megan that I had vanished. They would panic immediately. They would assume the drugs had caused a manic episode and I had wandered off into the cold morning. Let them panic. Let them waste their precious time driving around the neighborhood looking for a confused old man. My lungs burned with every step as I closed the distance of the 2 blocks. My rusty Ford Explorer sat exactly where I had left it, tucked deep into the dark shadows of a massive oak tree. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking violently from the adrenaline and the biting winter frost. I unlocked the heavy door, threw myself into the driver's seat, and slammed it shut. The quiet interior of the car wrapped around me, but my heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I reached into my coat and pulled out the metal thermos and the leather portfolio. They were completely safe. I had the physical evidence of their attempted murder and the original deed to my entire life. I pushed the key into the ignition. The old engine coughed a few times before roaring to life, a sound that felt like an absolute victory. I did not turn on my headlights until I was 3 streets away from my neighborhood. I turned the heater on high, letting the warm air thaw my frozen hands and face. The rear-view mirror reflected a man with dirt on his cheeks and cobwebs in his gray hair, but the eyes staring back at me were not those of a victim. They were the eyes of a father who had just buried his son in his heart. I merged onto the main highway, heading straight for the city limits. The morning traffic was just beginning to build around me. Commuters were drinking their coffee and listening to the morning news, entirely unaware of the absolute nightmare I had just survived. I navigated the familiar roads with a cold, mechanical precision. My destination was the downtown office building of my longtime attorney, Mr. Reynolds. He was a ruthless corporate lawyer who owed his early career to a massive favor my late wife had done for his family decades ago. He was exactly the kind of man you needed by your side when you were about to burn a family bridge to ash. I gripped the steering wheel tight, watching the tall city skyline rise in the distance. The game of hiding in the dark basement was over for good. It was time to bring all of their secrets into the unforgiving light. The morning traffic blurred past my windshield as I drove my rusty Ford Explorer into the heart of downtown Chicago. My hands were still coated in the frozen dirt from my own side yard, and my ribs ached fiercely from squeezing through that narrow basement window. I pulled into the underground parking garage of a towering glass high-rise. The pristine corporate environment felt entirely alien to a man who had spent his life in a machine shop, but I knew exactly where I was going. I rode the silent elevator up to the 42nd floor. The polished brass doors slid open to reveal the immaculate reception area of the city's most ruthless corporate law firm. The receptionist, a young woman in a tailored suit, looked up with mild alarm as I approached her desk. I knew I looked like a vagrant with cobwebs clinging to my gray hair and a heavy wool coat scraped up from the concrete. She opened her mouth to ask if I was lost, but I did not give her the chance. I told her I needed to see Arthur Reynolds immediately. She hesitated and told me Mr. Reynolds was in a conference and could not be disturbed. I leaned heavily against her polished marble desk and told her to call his office right now and say Ronald was here to collect the debt he owed my late wife. Her eyes widened slightly, but she picked up her phone and pressed a button. Less than a minute later, the heavy mahogany doors at the end of the hallway swung wide open. Arthur Reynolds stepped out. He was a man in his late 50s wearing a dark custom suit with a sharp, calculating gaze that had terrified opposing counsel for decades. Before he became a partner at this firm, he was a struggling law student drowning in medical debt. My late wife had quietly paid for his final year of tuition from her own modest savings because she believed in him. He had sworn to her that if we ever needed anything, he would tear the world apart to get it done. Arthur took one look at my bruised face and the wild look in my eyes and immediately ushered me into his private office. The room smelled of expensive leather and polished wood. He locked the heavy door behind us and asked me what on earth had happened. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I walked straight over to his massive mahogany desk and slammed the metal thermos down so hard the wood echoed. Next to the thermos, I dropped the thick leather portfolio I had pulled from my hidden basement compartment. Arthur stared at the items and then looked back at my face. He asked if I was in some kind of trouble. I took a slow, ragged breath and told him my own son was trying to murder me. Arthur stood perfectly still. He was a man who dealt in hostile takeovers and corporate espionage, but the raw gravity of my statement left him completely speechless. He slowly walked around his desk and asked me to explain exactly what I meant. I pulled the forged power of attorney documents out of my coat pocket and slid them across the polished wood. I told Arthur that Christopher and his wife, Megan, had hired a fake physician to prescribe me lethal doses of heavy sedatives. I pointed to the metal thermos and explained that it was filled with spiked dark roast coffee they had tried to force down my throat just an hour ago. I laid out the entire plot. I told him they planned to drug me into a stupor, forge a medical evaluation by Friday, and lock me in a county psychiatric ward so they could liquidate my home to pay off their hidden debts. Arthur picked up the forged documents. His sharp eyes scanned the dense legal paragraphs that Christopher had typed out. I watched his expression shift from shock to a deep, cold, professional anger. He set the papers down and looked at me with a profound sadness. He warned me that what I was about to ask him to do would be permanent. He said, "Ronald, you need to understand that if we move forward with this, you are not just taking legal action. You are launching a nuclear strike against your own flesh and blood. Once we cross this line, there is absolutely no going back." He asked if I was completely sure I wanted to sever my relationship with my only son forever. I stood there in the quiet elegance of his office and felt the last remaining fragment of my paternal love harden into stone. I looked my lawyer dead in the eye and told him my son died at midnight when he handed over that check. The man living in my house right now was nothing but a parasite waiting to feed on my corpse. Arthur gave a slow, solemn nod. The hesitation vanished from his face, replaced entirely by the ruthless corporate shark my wife had helped create. He sat down in his high-backed leather chair and asked me what my orders were. My voice was dead calm as I gave him my directives. I told him I needed a rush toxicology screen performed on the coffee inside that metal thermos. I wanted absolute, undeniable medical proof of the unauthorized sedatives they were using to poison me. Then I reached into the leather portfolio and pulled out my original unencumbered property deed, along with the paperwork for my $800,000 offshore life insurance trust. I slid them across the desk. I demanded the immediate and irrevocable transfer of my entire estate. I instructed Arthur to lock the deed to my house and every single penny I owned inside a blind trust managed by the Veterans Charity Foundation. I wanted it structured so that I retained an exclusive, untouchable life estate, allowing me to live in the home until I passed away, but making it absolutely impossible for Christopher to ever sell, borrow against, or inherit the property. I wanted my assets buried behind so much legal armor that not even an army of lawyers could crack it. Arthur picked up his gold pen and began making rapid notes on a legal pad. He promised me the toxicology report would be expedited through a private lab he kept on retainer. He assured me the trust documents would be drafted, filed, and sealed by the end of the day. He said by the time the sun set, my son would legally own nothing but the clothes on his back. But then Arthur paused and looked up at me with genuine concern. He pointed out a glaring flaw in our timeline. He said, "Ronald, the legal trap will be set by tonight, but your son still thinks you are locked in the basement. If he goes down there and finds you missing, he will panic. He will call the police and report a wandering elderly man with severe dementia. They will start a city-wide manhunt, and if they find you wandering the streets, they might inadvertently hand you right back over to Christopher before we have the evidence to arrest him." A cold chill washed over me. Arthur was completely right. I had the legal upper hand now, but Christopher still controlled the narrative. If I stayed away from the house, they would use my disappearance as proof of my mental decline. They would paint me as a confused old man who had squeezed out of a basement window in a fit of paranoia. I could not hide in a hotel. I could not stay in Arthur's office. The only way to spring the trap perfectly was to be standing right on the mark when the trapdoor opened. I buttoned my heavy wool coat and looked at the clock on the office wall. I told Arthur I was going back to the house. Arthur dropped his pen and stood up, protesting immediately. He told me I was out of my mind. He said walking back into a house with people actively trying to drug me was a death sentence. I shook my head and told him it was the only way to blindside them. I had to squeeze back through that basement window before Christopher realized I was gone. I had to go back to lying on that bare mattress next to the rusted furnace and pretend that their poison was slowly eroding my mind. I had to endure their psychological warfare and play the part of the broken victim until Friday night. I told Arthur to secure the toxicology report and prepare the police. When Friday evening arrived and they brought that fake doctor into my dining room to sign my life away, I needed Arthur to walk through my front door and end the war. Arthur looked at me with a mixture of disbelief and profound respect. He agreed to the plan. He handed me a secure prepaid burner phone from his desk drawer and told me to keep it hidden at all times. He promised to text me the moment the toxicology results came back. I turned and walked out of the mahogany doors, leaving my life savings and my property deed in his capable hands. I rode the elevator back down to the parking garage, the weight of the coming battle pressing heavy on my chest. I had to drive back to the suburbs, sneak into my own basement, and let my son believe he was winning. The hardest part was not snapping the lock on the filing cabinet. The hardest part was going to be looking the people trying to kill me in the eye and smiling. The massive mahogany doors of the office swung shut, and the real work began. Arthur Reynolds did not waste a single second. He pressed a button on his desk phone and summoned his 2 senior paralegals into the room. They arrived carrying thick legal pads and looked at me with quiet, professional curiosity. Arthur ordered them to cancel his morning appointments and lock down the conference room. The legal machinery of the most ruthless corporate law firm in Chicago was fully engaging, and it was entirely focused on protecting my life. I sat in the heavy leather chair and watched as they began to construct an impenetrable fortress around my assets. I handed over the leather portfolio, and Arthur explained the mechanics of the irrevocable trust in cold, precise terms. We were not just hiding my money. We were building a financial vault that Christopher could never crack, even if he brought an army of lawyers. I instructed them to name the Veterans Charity Foundation as the sole absolute beneficiary of my entire estate. This included the $800,000 offshore life insurance policy and the deed to the brick house I had built with my own hands. I watched the paralegals type furiously on their laptops, drafting the binding clauses. I insisted on one very specific condition. I required an exclusive, untouchable life estate. This meant that while the charity technically owned the property, I retained the absolute legal right to live in the home until my last breath. Arthur made sure the wording was flawless. He added specific stipulations that no external party could override the life estate, not even someone claiming to hold medical or financial power of attorney. If Christopher managed to trick a judge into giving him control over my health, he would still have absolutely zero authority to sell or mortgage the house. He would be legally powerless. The estate would be a ghost to him. I sat there drinking a glass of water, feeling the warmth slowly return to my frozen bones, while the printers in the hallway began to hum. Every page that printed was another brick in the wall, shutting my son out of my life forever. When the massive stack of documents was finally ready, Arthur dismissed the paralegals and called in a private notary. The notary was a quiet, older woman who carried a heavy brass stamp. She placed the paperwork on the polished wood of the desk and smoothed out the pages. Arthur picked up a heavy gold fountain pen, but he did not hand it to me right away. He looked across the desk, his sharp eyes softening with a heavy, solemn weight. He told me that he needed to give me one final formal warning, as my legal counsel and as a man who respected my late wife. He said, "Ronald, I need you to look at these papers and understand the gravity of what you are about to do. Once you sign on that dotted line, the transfer is absolute and permanent. You are permanently disinheriting the boy you raised. If Christopher ever finds himself facing financial ruin or homelessness, you will not be able to liquidate this house to save him. You are legally and financially severing the bloodline." He asked me to take a deep breath and be absolutely certain before I picked up the pen. I looked down at the thick stack of white paper. My mind drifted back to a summer afternoon 30 years ago. I remembered teaching Christopher how to ride a bicycle in our driveway. I remembered the pride in his eyes when he finally balanced on his own. Then that warm memory was violently replaced by the cold reality of last night. I remembered the dark liquid swirling in the coffee mug. I remembered the heavy padlock chaining my entire life inside a basement filing cabinet. I remembered the cold, arrogant tone of his voice as he banished me to the freezing cellar so he could move his bankrupt in-laws into my bedroom. He did not see me as a father anymore. He saw me as livestock waiting to be slaughtered for a payout. I reached across the desk and took the heavy gold pen from Arthur's hand. I looked my lawyer dead in the eye, and my voice did not waver a single fraction. I told him my son died at midnight. I pressed the nib of the pen to the paper and signed my full name. I signed page after page, initialing every clause and every binding addendum. The notary stepped forward and pressed her heavy brass stamp onto the final page, sealing the transaction with a loud, definitive thud. The legal trap was officially armed. Christopher was now hunting for a treasure that no longer existed. I gathered my coat and thanked Arthur for his swift work. He told me to keep my burner phone fully charged and hidden deep in my pockets. He promised that when Friday evening arrived, he would be standing on my porch, ready to bring the entire house of cards down. I walked out of the towering glass high-rise and stepped back into the bitter winter morning. The adrenaline that had kept me moving was beginning to fade, leaving behind a deep, crushing physical exhaustion. But I could not rest yet. The hardest part of the mission was still ahead of me. I drove my rusty Ford Explorer back toward the quiet suburban streets. The morning traffic was clearing, and the neighborhood was waking up. Every minute that passed increased the danger. Christopher and Megan were likely unpacking boxes upstairs right now. Eventually, one of them would go down to the basement to check if the heavy sedatives had completely incapacitated me. If they looked through the dark cellar and found an empty mattress, their entire plan would shift into a frantic panic. They would call the local police and report a missing elderly man suffering from severe dementia. The authorities would start a massive manhunt, and my carefully laid trap would be ruined by a premature intervention. I parked my truck exactly where I had left it, 2 blocks away, hidden under the thick, barren branches of the old oak tree. I zipped my wool coat up to my chin and began the long, treacherous walk back to my own property. I kept my head down, pulling my collar up to hide my face from any neighbors looking out their front windows. I slipped through the narrow alleyways, avoiding the main sidewalks. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs as I approached my own side fence. I pressed my back against the cold brick siding of the house, listening intently for any sounds coming from inside. I heard the faint, muffled noise of a television playing in the living room. They were comfortable. They thought they had already won. I crept through the frozen dirt of the side yard until I reached the small egress window near the foundation. The glass was still pushed inward exactly as I had left it. I crouched down in the freezing mud and looked into the dark abyss of the basement. I had to squeeze my aching body back through that narrow frame and return to the role of the broken, dying victim before anyone came down those wooden stairs. I took a deep breath of the sharp and pushed my head into the dark opening, ready to climb back inside my own prison. The rough concrete scraped painfully against my ribs as I forced my broad shoulders back through the narrow egress window. The freezing winter wind rushed into the stale basement behind me, but I could not afford the luxury of a deep breath. I gripped the wooden stool with my aching hands and lowered my heavy work boots onto the dusty floor. I had just enough time to push the rusted glass shut and wipe the fresh outdoor mud from the sleeves of my heavy wool coat. Right above my head, the floorboards in the kitchen gave a sharp, heavy groan. The distinct sound of footsteps approached the basement door. Someone was coming down. I tossed my coat into the dark corner behind the furnace, hiding the dirt and the winter chill. I scrambled toward the bare mattress lying on the cold concrete and threw my heavy body onto the thin, scratchy blanket. I forced my racing heart to calm and slowed my breathing to a shallow, ragged rhythm. I let my jaw go slack and allowed my eyes to roll back slightly into a hollow, vacant stare. I had to become the broken ghost they desperately wanted me to be. The heavy deadbolt at the top of the stairs clicked open with a loud metallic snap. A bright sliver of kitchen light cut aggressively through the damp gloom of the cellar. The wooden steps creaked in a slow, deliberate rhythm as Megan made her way down. She was holding a cheap plastic tray. I could smell the bland, depressing scent of cold, plain oatmeal before she even reached the bottom of the staircase. She stepped into the dim, flickering light of the single overhead bulb and looked down at my prone body. Her eyes were completely void of any warmth or basic human decency. She was not looking at a father. She was inspecting a medical specimen to see if the lethal poison had taken full effect. I let a small line of saliva pool at the corner of my mouth and blinked up at her with slow, uncomprehending confusion. Megan crouched down next to the mattress and set the plastic tray on the dirty floor. She did not offer me a spoon or a napkin or a glass of water. She simply stared at my face, studying the way my rough hands rested against the blanket. I forced my fingers to twitch in a sporadic, disjointed rhythm, perfectly mimicking the severe neurological decay the fake doctor had promised them. I mumbled her name, but I purposely slurred the syllables together, making it sound like thick, unintelligible nonsense. I looked around the dark room and asked her where my late wife had gone, pretending my mind had violently slipped 2 decades into the past. A cold, deeply satisfied smile spread across the face of my daughter-in-law. She stood up and casually brushed the basement dust off her expensive designer jeans. She told me my wife was gone, and that I just needed to eat my cold oatmeal and go back to sleep. She spoke to me with the loud, slow, arrogant cadence you would use to scold a stubborn stray dog. It took every single ounce of discipline in my 70-year-old bones not to leap up from that mattress and wrap my calloused hands around her arrogant throat. I kept my eyes dull and unfocused, letting my head loll to the side, as if the simple effort of looking up at her was simply too much for my poisoned brain. Megan turned around, but she did not head back to the wooden stairs right away. She walked over to the small, rusted metal crate I was using as a makeshift nightstand next to the furnace. She pulled a neatly folded white paper from her back pocket and smoothed it out flat on the metal surface. She reached into her pocket again and placed a cheap plastic pen right next to it. She walked back over to my mattress and told me Christopher needed me to sign a simple medical waiver for my new memory vitamins. She said it was just a standard routine form from the local pharmacy that needed my signature today. I looked past her shoulder at the white paper resting on the metal crate. Even in the terrible dim lighting of the basement, I could clearly see the bold black text printed across the top of the page. It was a voluntary surrender of medical autonomy. It was a forged legal document designed to give Christopher immediate emergency control over my health decisions without needing to wait for a judge on Monday morning. Megan was not just asking for a simple signature. She was actively testing my lucidity. She was testing the effectiveness of the poison in my blood. I realized instantly that this was a psychological trap. If I sat up and read that paper carefully, my cover would be completely blown. If I questioned the dense legal terminology, or asked why Christopher was not down here asking me himself, she would know instantly that my mind was perfectly sharp. A man suffering from drug-induced cognitive failure would not analyze a legal document. He would either sign it blindly in his deep confusion or lack the basic motor skills to hold the pen at all. I let my eyes drift lazily away from the legal trap and stared blankly at the bowl of cold oatmeal sitting on the floor. I let out a long, confused groan and curled my body away from her, turning my face toward the rusted iron of the furnace. I ignored the pen entirely. Megan watched me for a long, tense minute, standing perfectly still in the dim light, waiting to see if the bait would be taken. Megan left the forged medical waiver on the rusted metal crate and walked back up the wooden stairs, the heavy deadbolt locked with a loud metallic click. For the next 48 hours, my own home became a psychological war zone. I remained trapped in the cold, damp cellar, lying on that thin, scratchy mattress next to the furnace. I only moved when I was absolutely certain the floorboards above me were completely silent. During the daylight hours, I had to perform the grueling role of a man whose mind was dissolving into absolute nothingness. Megan would come down twice a day with the same bland, depressing meals, dropping a plastic tray of cold food onto the dusty concrete. She spoke to me slowly and loudly, as if I were deaf and entirely foolish, but I never broke character. I kept my eyes vacant and my responses limited to slurred, confused mumbles. I watched her smirk every time I pretended to stumble or forget my own name. The real torture was not the cold or the terrible food. The real torture was listening to the invasion happening right above my head. By Wednesday afternoon, the heavy thud of moving boxes and loud, arrogant voices echoed through the ceiling. Megan had officially moved her parents, Paul and Diane, into my master bedroom. I lay in the dark, listening to Diane complain loudly about the color of my late wife's curtains. I heard Paul walking through the hallways, openly declaring which of my antique furniture pieces they were going to sell first. They stomped across the hardwood floors with absolute entitlement. They treated my house like a luxury hotel they had just won in a lottery. They threw a dinner party that very night, right above me, laughing and clinking expensive wine glasses, while I sat in the freezing dirt below them. They were celebrating their new wealthy lifestyle, while the man who paid for it was treated like an animal in a cage. But my family made one massive tactical mistake. They assumed I was just an ignorant old man who did not understand the mechanics of his own house. When you spend 40 years building and fixing heavy machinery, you learn exactly how sound travels through metal. I knew the old aluminum air ducts running across the basement ceiling, connected directly to the floor registers in the kitchen and the living room. It was a perfect acoustic pipeline straight into their private conversations. When the house finally settled down, I dragged my wooden stool over to the main ventilation shaft in the dark. I reached up with aching shoulders and carefully unscrewed the metal grating. I took my personal smartphone, which I had kept completely silent and hidden deep inside my coat pocket, and wedged it securely inside the aluminum duct. I hit the record button and let it capture every single word echoing down from the rooms above. On Thursday evening, my patience paid off in full. I stood on the stool with my ear pressed against the cold metal, listening, as a bitter argument erupted in the kitchen directly over my head. It was Christopher and Megan. Their voices were tight and frantic, completely stripped of the arrogant confidence they had displayed to my face. Megan was crying, but it was not out of guilt or remorse. It was out of pure financial panic. She hissed at Christopher, demanding to know if the lawyer was ready to file the paperwork on Monday morning. She reminded him that her parents, Paul and Diane, had just finalized their complete bankruptcy and had literally nowhere else to go. They had lost their condo and their savings and were entirely dependent on this scheme working. Christopher snapped back at her, telling her to keep her voice down before someone heard them. He paced across the kitchen floor, sounding like a trapped, desperate animal. He told her she needed to stop nagging him because his own creditors were threatening to take his cars and seize his bank accounts. He said the shell company he had built was completely collapsing, and he was weeks away from facing criminal fraud charges if he could not secure a massive influx of cash. The pieces of their filthy puzzle finally snapped together perfectly in my mind. This entire plot was a desperate, coordinated bailout for all four of them. Christopher and Megan were drowning in hidden debt, and her parents had lost absolutely everything. My home was the only life raft left, and they were fully willing to drown me to take it. I held my breath and listened closely as Christopher laid out the final timeline. He told Megan that everything hinged entirely on Friday night. He said Dr. Evans was coming to the family dinner to perform his final medical evaluation. Once Evans signed the official commitment papers declaring me a danger to myself, Christopher would march into the courthouse on Monday morning and secure absolute financial and medical power of attorney. He promised Megan they would put me in a state-run psychiatric ward by Tuesday and put the house on the market by Wednesday. He told her the estate would sell for enough cash to clear his massive debts and buy a new property for her bankrupt parents to live in. They had completely monetized my existence down to the final dollar. They were selling my freedom to buy their own. The argument faded as they moved out of the kitchen and back into the living room. I reached into the air duct and retrieved my phone, stopping the recording. I had it. I had pristine, crystal-clear audio of my son and his wife discussing their crippling debts, their bankrupt in-laws, and their explicit, premeditated plan to lock me in a psychiatric ward for a financial bailout. It was the exact kind of undeniable evidence a jury would need to hear to put them behind bars. I climbed down from the stool and sank onto the bare mattress. Hearing your own child plot your destruction is a pain that no physical wound could ever match. It breaks a fundamental piece of your soul. But the sorrow was quickly burned away by the cold, hard necessity of survival. I had to stay focused. Friday was only hours away, and the trap was almost set. The basement grew darker as the evening dragged on. I sat in the corner waiting for the house to quiet down so I could attempt to get some sleep. The damp chill of the cellar was sinking deep into my joints, making every movement ache. Suddenly, a sharp vibration startled me. It was not my regular phone. It was the secure, prepaid burner phone Arthur Reynolds had given me, tucked deep inside the inner pocket of my wool coat. I pulled it out into the dim light. The screen glowed brightly in the shadows, displaying a single encrypted text message from my attorney. My heart began to hammer against my ribs as I read the short, terrifying sentence. The message said the toxicology screen came back from the private lab, and I needed to see the results immediately. The trap was finally closing, but the poison they had used was far worse than I ever imagined. The pale blue light of the burner phone cut through the absolute darkness of the freezing basement. I sat on the edge of the thin, scratchy mattress and stared at the glowing screen. The encrypted text message from my attorney, Arthur Reynolds, was short, but the weight of the words felt like a physical blow to my chest. He had received the results from the private laboratory. The Rush toxicology screen on the dark roast coffee I had poured into my metal thermos was complete. I pressed my thumb against the screen to open the full detailed report he had forwarded to me. The clinical language on the digital document outlined a nightmare far worse than simple chemical restraint. The laboratory technicians had isolated massive, unauthorized doses of heavy industrial antipsychotics mixed directly into the coffee. Reynolds had included a stark explanation from a medical expert he kept on retainer. The expert confirmed that this specific cocktail of drugs was not just a heavy sleep aid designed to make an elderly man docile or confused. For a man of 70 years old with a normal heart rate, introducing that level of severe chemical depressants would cause a catastrophic spike in blood pressure, followed by a rapid deceleration of the central nervous system. It was a precise, calculated formula designed to trigger a massive paralytic stroke or induce sudden, irreversible heart failure. I let the phone drop onto the mattress and stared blankly at the rusted iron body of the furnace. The cold concrete floor seemed to fall away beneath my heavy work boots. The entire landscape of the war had fundamentally shifted in the blink of an eye. This was never just a desperate financial crime engineered by a bankrupt son and a greedy daughter-in-law. Christopher and Megan were not merely trying to steal my property deed to pay off their hidden debts. They were fully prepared and actively attempting to commit premeditated murder. If my survival instincts had not kicked in yesterday morning, if I had taken even 2 sips of that warm, dark liquid to appease them, I would not be hiding in my own cellar right now. I would be lying on a stainless steel slab in the county morgue. Christopher would be shedding fake tears at my funeral, playing the part of the devastated, grieving son, while waiting for his massive inheritance check to clear. The profound depth of their betrayal ripped away the final lingering shreds of my fatherly mercy. When I first climbed back through that narrow egress window, I only wanted to stop them from taking my house. I thought I could outsmart them, secure my assets, and kick them out onto the freezing street with absolutely nothing to their names. I wanted to teach them a harsh financial lesson. But simply evicting them was no longer a viable option. Eviction was a mild punishment for bad tenants. Attempted murder required complete and total annihilation. I had to ensure that Christopher, Megan, and the fake physician never saw the outside of a federal prison cell again. I picked the burner phone back up and typed a response using slow, deliberate keystrokes. I instructed Arthur Reynolds to secure the physical laboratory reports and hand-deliver them directly to his highest contact within the local police department. Reynolds replied almost immediately, confirming that a senior detective was already reviewing the medical evidence alongside the audio recordings I had captured through the air ducts. The authorities were entirely on board and ready to move, but they needed to catch the conspirators in the act, to secure airtight felony convictions for every single person involved. They needed the fake physician to cross the threshold of my home and physically present the forged medical documents on Friday night. I turned off the burner phone and slid it deep into the lining of my heavy wool coat, making sure it was completely hidden. I sat in the silent dark and listened to the mundane sounds of the house above my head. Paul and Diane were walking heavily across the kitchen floor, laughing loudly about something entirely trivial. Megan was humming a cheerful tune while loading the dishwasher. Christopher was likely sitting comfortably in my living room, calculating the massive payout he believed he was receiving by the end of the week. They were completely oblivious to the fact that they were dancing on top of a live landmine. I knew the next 24 hours were going to be the most dangerous period of my entire life. I had to completely sell the illusion of a dying, helpless man. If I showed even a fraction of a percent of my true mental lucidity, they would panic. If Christopher suspected the poison was somehow failing to destroy my brain, he might try a more direct and violent physical approach to silence me before Friday night arrived. I had to fully embrace the shadows of the cellar and become the broken victim they had paid for. Morning eventually arrived with a dull gray light filtering through the dirty glass of the small egress window. The heavy deadbolt clicked open at the top of the wooden stairs with a loud metallic snap. I immediately dropped my head back onto the mattress and let my eyes roll into a vacant, hollow stare. Megan began her slow descent down the creaking steps carrying another plastic tray. Today she brought a bowl of watered-down soup and another steaming ceramic mug filled with dark, poisoned liquid. I knew I could not use the hidden thermos trick again while she was standing right over me watching my every move. I had to rely on sheer physical acting to survive the morning. As she stepped into the dim light of the overhead bulb, I let my body completely slacken. I dragged my heavy frame up from the mattress, moving with agonizing, uncoordinated slowness. Megan held the tray out toward me with a cold, arrogant smirk. Before she could set it down, I lunged forward with a sudden violent spasm, pretending my motor skills had completely failed. I knocked the plastic tray right out of her hands with a clumsy swipe. The bowl of soup splattered across the dusty concrete, and the ceramic mug shattered into dozens of jagged pieces, sending the toxic liquid soaking deep into the dirt. Megan cursed loudly and leaped backward to avoid the hot mess splashing onto her designer shoes. I collapsed back onto the mattress, letting out a low, confused groan and curling my body away from her. She looked down at the shattered mug and the spilled poison with an expression of pure, disgusted triumph. She did not offer to clean up the sharp ceramic shards or bring me another meal to replace the one I had ruined. She simply sneered at me and said the heavy drugs were finally melting my brain right on schedule. She promised me that by tomorrow night, I would not even be able to remember my own name. She turned on her heel and marched confidently back up the wooden stairs, locking the heavy door behind her with a definitive slam. I sat alone in the freezing basement, staring at the puddle of toxic liquid seeping into the concrete floor. I was hungry, exhausted, and my joints ached terribly from the damp cold. But beneath the profound physical pain, a relentless fire burned bright in my chest. I had the audio recordings of their explicit confessions. I had the irrevocable trust protecting my entire estate. I had the formal toxicology report proving their murderous intent. I just had to survive one more day in the dark before I brought my entire house crashing down on their heads. Thursday morning arrived with a bitter chill that seeped right through the concrete walls of the basement. I had spent the night mentally preparing for the final phase of my performance. The poisoned coffee from yesterday had soaked into the dirt floor, leaving a faint, bitter smell in the air. I knew today had to be my masterpiece. I could not just act tired or sluggish anymore. I had to convince my son and his wife that my mind had completely fractured into a million unrecoverable pieces. I waited until I heard the heavy footsteps of Paul and Diane walking across the kitchen floor above me. I knew Megan and Christopher would be up there with them drinking their morning coffee and discussing their new wealthy lifestyle. I took off my boots and my thick wool socks, leaving my feet completely bare against the freezing concrete. I messed up my gray hair, making it look wild and unkempt. I unbuttoned my flannel shirt crookedly and let my shoulders droop until I looked like a frail, hollow shell of a human being. I slowly climbed the wooden basement stairs. I did not knock or ask for permission. I pushed the basement door open and stepped right into the bright, warm kitchen. The four of them were sitting around my mahogany dining table laughing and eating a lavish breakfast. The laughter died the absolute second they saw me standing there. I kept my eyes wide and vacant, staring right through them as if they were complete strangers. I shuffled slowly across the hardwood floor, letting my bare feet drag heavily against the wood. I looked directly at Christopher and called him by his uncle's name. I asked him in a shaky, confused whisper why he was sitting in my kitchen and where my late wife had gone. I told him I was late for my shift at the machine shop, and I could not find my heavy steel-toed boots. The room was dead silent for a long, terrifying moment. Then I saw a slow, cruel smile spread across my son's face. He looked at Megan and then looked over at his bankrupt father-in-law, Paul. Christopher did not try to comfort me. He did not guide me to a chair or offer me a warm blanket. He just leaned back in his expensive dining chair and crossed his arms over his chest. He spoke to me with a loud, condescending tone you would use to humor a slow toddler. He told me my shift at the machine shop was canceled today and that I just needed to go back down to my room and rest. I kept my face perfectly blank and let my jaw go slack. I wandered aimlessly toward the living room, dragging my hands along the floral wallpaper, as if I needed the physical support to keep my balance. Christopher did not even bother to lower his voice as I walked away. He laughed softly and told Paul that the new memory vitamins were working miracles. He said the old man was completely gone, and by tomorrow night, the doctor would not even have to ask any difficult questions. Paul chuckled around a mouthful of food and said it was about time because he was tired of living out of a cardboard suitcase and wanted to start remodeling the kitchen by next week. I stood in the living room, staring blankly at the dark television screen, while my blood boiled hot in my veins. They were completely openly discussing the liquidation of my life, while I was standing less than 20 feet away from them. Their arrogance was blinding them to every single red flag. They thought they had entirely broken me, but they were only fueling my extreme focus. I shuffled back toward the basement door, keeping my head bowed low, and descended back into the freezing dark. The rest of the day was a grueling test of physical and mental endurance. I lay on the bare mattress, staring at the rusted iron of the furnace, while the hours crawled by at an agonizing pace. I listened to the sounds of my house being violated. I heard Diane taking inventory of my late wife's jewelry collection. Upstairs in the master bedroom, I heard Megan calling a local real estate agent on her cell phone to schedule a preliminary house appraisal for next Wednesday. Every sound echoing through the floorboards was a fresh stab of betrayal, but I welcomed the pain. It kept me sharp. It kept me angry. It kept me ready for the final confrontation. As the sun finally began to set, casting long, dark shadows across the cellar, the heavy deadbolt at the top of the stairs clicked open one last time. I heard Christopher's heavy boots walking down the wooden steps. I did not move a single muscle. I lay on my side, curled up on the thin, scratchy blanket, and kept my breathing slow and shallow. Christopher stopped just a few feet away from my mattress. He stood over me, looking down at his own father with absolute disgust. He told me to listen to him very closely. He said tomorrow night was going to be a very special evening for our family. He announced with supreme, arrogant confidence that they were hosting a family wellness dinner right upstairs in the formal dining room. He said Dr. Evans was coming over to officially evaluate my worsening condition and make my care transition entirely permanent. He promised me that by the end of tomorrow I would be resting comfortably in a facility where I could not hurt myself or become a burden to anyone else. He spoke the lies so smoothly, he almost sounded like a caring son trying to do the right thing for a sick parent. But I knew the ugly truth. I knew Dr. Evans was coming to collect the second half of his illegal blood money. I knew Christopher was coming to forcefully strip my signature and throw me into a locked asylum. I let out a weak, pathetic moan and closed my eyes, acting as if his cruel words were just meaningless noise floating through my decayed brain. Christopher scoffed, kicked the edge of my mattress with his heavy leather boot, and turned around. He marched back up the wooden stairs and locked the door tight without looking back. When the metallic snap of the deadbolt echoed through the dark cellar, I finally opened my eyes. The performance for the day was officially over. The illusion of my complete compliance had worked flawlessly. Christopher was wrapped in a false blanket of absolute arrogant security. He thought he had already won the war. He had absolutely no idea that I had spent the last 48 hours handing the local police department a loaded gun. The battleground was officially set for Friday night. I lay in the quiet dark and waited for the sun to rise on the day my son would lose everything. The pale morning light finally broke through the dirty glass of the egress window, bringing the dawn of Friday. It was the most important day of my entire life. I lay on the thin, scratchy blanket, my bones aching from the unrelenting damp cold of the concrete cellar. Every muscle in my 70-year-old body screamed in protest, but my mind was sharper than it had been in decades. The burner phone hidden deep inside the lining of my wool coat vibrated with a soft, brief hum. It was the signal I had been waiting for all night. I pulled the small device out into the shadows and saw a secure message from my attorney, Arthur Reynolds. He told me the local police department was fully briefed and ready to mobilize. The senior detective who had reviewed my audio recordings and the devastating toxicology report had secured all the necessary warrants. The authorities knew about the lethal doses of unauthorized antipsychotics they had tried to feed me. They knew about Christopher's hidden debts and the desperate plot to lock me in a county psychiatric ward. But Arthur made one thing absolutely clear in his message. He explained the strict legal threshold we had to cross to guarantee that no one in that house could escape a long prison sentence. If the police kicked the front door down right now, Christopher could easily claim he had simply been exploring legal care options for a sick father. Dr. Evans could lie and say he was merely making a routine house call to evaluate a patient. We needed to catch them actively committing the crime. Arthur typed out the exact parameters of the trap. He said we needed the fake physician to physically present the forged medical commitment papers in my home. We needed Christopher to lay the fraudulent power of attorney on the table and demand my signature. Only when the extortion and the fraud were actively taking place would the trap snap shut with absolute permanent finality. I had to sit at that dining room table and play the ultimate broken victim. I had to let them place the pen in my hand. I typed back a simple confirmation. I sent Arthur a detailed description of the house layout. I explained that the formal dining room was located at the very front of the property, featuring large bay windows that faced the quiet suburban street. I told him the police could position their vehicles out of sight around the corner, while plainclothes officers approached the front lawn under the cover of darkness. They would be close enough to see into the brightly lit room, but completely hidden by the winter shadows. Arthur promised me he would be standing right on my front porch, waiting for the exact perfect second to ring the doorbell and end the war. The daylight hours dragged on with a grueling, agonizing slowness. I dragged my wooden stool over to the air duct one last time and listened to the sounds of my own house being prepared for a celebration. It was not a dinner to honor my health. It was a victory feast for my executioners. I heard the clatter of pots and pans and the sizzling of expensive cuts of meat. Megan was cooking a lavish, extravagant meal to celebrate their incoming wealth. The smell of roasted garlic and rich buttery sauces drifted down through the aluminum vents, twisting my empty stomach into knots. I had survived on cold oatmeal and tap water for 3 days, but the hunger only fueled my profound, burning rage. Through the vents, I listened to Paul and Diane talking loudly in the kitchen. Megan's bankrupt parents were already discussing what they wanted to do with the money once my estate was fully liquidated. Paul laughed and said he had his eye on a new luxury boat, while Diane talked about taking a month-long vacation to Europe to recover from the stress of their recent financial ruin. They were gleefully dividing up the spoils of my life while I sat freezing in the dirt right beneath their feet. They felt absolutely zero remorse for the man they were destroying. As the sun finally went down, the atmosphere in the house shifted from arrogant celebration to a tense, breathless anticipation. I climbed down from the stool and hid it back in the dark corner. I smoothed down my wrinkled flannel shirt and prepared my body for the final performance. At exactly 7 o'clock, the front doorbell rang upstairs. The heavy silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. I heard the front door open and the hushed, frantic greetings exchanged in the foyer. Dr. Evans had arrived. I heard Christopher lead the fake physician directly into the dining room. Their voices were low, but carried the distinct sharp edge of criminal business. Christopher told Evans he had the second half of the payment ready in cash, but he expected the commitment papers to be signed and officially stamped before the night was over. Evans replied with a cold, soulless laugh, assuring my son that the paperwork was flawless and that I would be legally erased by Monday morning. The transaction was complete. The executioners were gathered. The heavy deadbolt at the top of the basement stairs snapped back with a violent crack. The door swung open, spilling bright yellow light down the wooden steps. Christopher marched down into the cellar. His heavy leather boots slammed against the wood, echoing like gunshots in the quiet dark. I let my body go completely limp on the bare mattress. I stared blankly at the rusted furnace, letting my jaw hang slack and my eyes drift out of focus. Christopher did not speak to me gently. He did not ask how I was feeling or if I needed help getting up. He grabbed me roughly by the upper arm and hauled my 70-year-old frame up from the mattress. His grip was tight and bruising. He dragged me toward the stairs, treating me like a heavy, useless piece of dead weight. I forced my legs to stumble and drag, playing the part of a man whose central nervous system was collapsing under the weight of heavy sedatives. I leaned heavily against the wooden railing, letting out soft, confused mumbles as he pulled me up the steps and out of the freezing dark. I was escorted out of the kitchen and pushed into the warm, brightly lit, formal dining room. I blinked rapidly, acting as though the harsh chandelier light was hurting my drug-addled eyes. But beneath my vacant stare, I was taking in every single detail of the room. The long mahogany table was set to absolute perfection. Tall white candles burned in the center, casting a warm, flickering glow over the crystal wine glasses and the perfectly folded linen napkins. Then I saw it. The sight hit me harder than any physical blow Christopher had ever dealt me. They had set the table using my late wife's fine china, the delicate white plates with the gold trim that she had painstakingly collected over a decade. The plates she only ever brought out for Thanksgiving dinners and our special wedding anniversaries. Megan had dug them out of the protective cases in the high cabinets to serve a celebratory dinner for the men plotting to murder me. It was the ultimate profound disrespect. It was a desecration of the only pure memory left in this house. I was shoved roughly into the heavy wooden chair at the head of the table. I let my hands fall limply into my lap and stared blankly ahead. The executioners were all seated around me. Paul and Diane sat to my left, their faces flushed with expensive red wine and undisguised greedy anticipation. Megan stood near the kitchen doorway holding a fresh bottle, holding her breath with a nervous, excited smile. Sitting directly across from me at the other end of my beautiful table was Dr. Evans. He wore a crisp, dark suit and stared at me with the detached, analytical gaze of a butcher evaluating his cut. Resting on the polished mahogany table right next to his wine glass was a thick stack of legal documents and a heavy black pen. The battleground was fully set. The trap was primed and loaded. I sat in my chair, surrounded by monsters, waiting for the absolute perfect second to tear their world apart. Christopher did not loosen his bruising grip on my upper arm as he forced me through the arched doorway of the formal dining room. I let my knees buckle slightly, playing the part of a man whose brain was drowning in heavy sedatives. I dragged my bare feet across the polished hardwood floor, letting out a soft, confused groan. The bright light from the massive crystal chandelier blinded me for a second, but I kept my eyes wide and vacant. The contrast between the freezing dark cellar and this warm, lavishly decorated room was staggering. The air was thick with the rich smell of roasted meats, buttered vegetables, and expensive red wine. It smelled exactly like a grand victory banquet. But the true horror was not the smell of the extravagant food or the blinding overhead light. It was the sight of the long mahogany table itself. Megan had set the large dining table with my late wife's pristine white and gold china. Those delicate plates were the single most treasured possession my wife had ever owned. She had saved up for years to buy that specific set piece by piece from a boutique in Chicago, and we only ever used them for our wedding anniversaries and Thanksgiving dinners. Now they were being used to serve a celebratory feast for the very people actively plotting to steal my life and erase my legacy. I felt a sudden violent surge of pure, unadulterated hatred burn deep in my chest. It took every single ounce of my lifelong discipline to keep my hands trembling helplessly at my sides instead of reaching out and overturning the entire heavy wooden table. I swallowed the bitter metallic rage, tasting blood where I had bitten the inside of my cheek, and let Christopher shove me roughly into the heavy armchair at the head of the table. I slumped forward, letting my chin drop near my chest, and stared blankly at the empty white plate in front of me. I was entirely surrounded by hungry waiting vultures. To my left sat Megan's parents, Paul and Diane. They did not even have the common decency to look ashamed or lower their voices when I was brought into the room. Paul was swirling a large glass of my expensive Cabernet, grinning openly at his wife. He reached across the table and helped himself to a thick slice of roasted meat, completely ignoring the fact that the man who paid for the food and the roof over his head was sitting right next to him. Diane was already wearing one of my late wife's pearl necklaces draped casually over her silk blouse. She leaned over and whispered loudly to Megan about which high-end interior decorator they should hire once the house was officially transferred to their names. They looked at me not as a human being or a family member, but as a minor inconvenience that was finally being disposed of so they could claim their new wealthy lifestyle. Megan stood near the kitchen entryway, holding a fresh bottle of wine. Her face was flushed with greedy anticipation. She was practically vibrating with nervous excitement, waiting for the ink to dry so she could finally take absolute possession of my home. Sitting directly across the long table from me was Dr. Evans. He did not look like a medical professional who had taken an oath to heal the sick. He looked like a corporate hitman wearing a crisp, dark-tailored suit and an expensive silk tie. He stared at me with cold, analytical eyes, evaluating my slumped posture and my vacant, drooling expression. He was looking for any sign that his lethal cocktail of heavy antipsychotics had failed to take full effect. I let a thin line of saliva gather at the corner of my mouth and blinked sluggishly, focusing my unfocused gaze on an empty space just past his left shoulder. I let my breathing grow shallow and ragged, perfectly mimicking the respiratory depression caused by chemical poisoning. Evans gave a small, highly satisfied nod. He was completely convinced that my central nervous system was collapsing exactly as he had planned. Christopher walked over and stood right behind my chair like a prison guard, ensuring his captive did not try to make a sudden escape. Dr. Evans cleared his throat and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished mahogany wood. He conducted his fake medical evaluation with a casual, terrifying indifference. He did not bother to check my pulse, look at my pupils, or ask how I was feeling physically. He simply asked me in a loud, slow, patronizing voice if I knew what day it was and if I remembered my own name. I let my head roll to the side and mumbled a string of complete, breathless nonsense, softly calling out for my late wife to come pick me up from the machine shop. Paul let out a short, cruel laugh from the side of the table, muttering that I was completely gone and they should just skip the pleasantries and get on with the paperwork. Diane shushed her husband, but she was smiling widely too. Dr. Evans reached down into his black leather briefcase resting on the carpeted floor and pulled out a thick stack of pristine white legal documents. The crisp sound of the heavy paper shuffling echoed loudly in the quiet dining room, cutting through the soft classical music Megan had playing in the background. He placed the heavy stack directly next to my empty dinner plate. Even with my eyes half closed, I could clearly see the bold black text printed across the top pages. They were the absolute voluntary surrender of my medical autonomy and the formal financial power of attorney documents. Beneath them were the official commitment papers declaring me a severe physical danger to myself and mandating my immediate transfer to a locked psychiatric ward. Evans tapped his fingers against the stack of papers and looked up at my son. He told Christopher that my cognitive decline was severe, accelerated, and completely irreversible. He declared with absolute false medical authority that I lacked the capacity to care for myself and that transferring my estate control tonight was the only safe legal option left. Christopher stepped away from the back of my chair and moved to the side of the table, so I was forced to look directly at him. The mask of the concerned, caring son completely evaporated from his face. There was no more fake sympathy in his eyes. There was only pure, calculated greed and a desperate, sweating urgency to secure his massive financial bailout before his hidden creditors destroyed him. He reached into his suit jacket pocket and pulled out a heavy silver pen. It was the exact same silver pen I had proudly gifted him when he graduated from college, the pen he was now using to sign my death warrant. He placed it on the pristine white tablecloth and slowly slid it across the smooth fabric until it rested right against the edge of the legal documents. The silver metal gleamed sharply under the bright chandelier lights. Christopher leaned down until his face was only inches away from mine. He dropped his voice to a low, freezing whisper, completely stripping away the illusion of family and revealing the monster hiding underneath. He told me to pick up the pen and sign my name on the dotted lines right now. He said if I did not sign the papers immediately, the doctor would call the state authorities to drag me out of the house by physical force. He coldly explained that if the state had to intervene, I would be thrown into the worst public ward in the county, where no one would ever come to visit me, and where I would be strapped to a hospital bed until I died. He promised me that signing the papers quietly was the only way to avoid spending the rest of my miserable life in a straitjacket. The dining room fell into absolute dead silence as all four of them stared at me, waiting for the broken old man to finally surrender his entire world. I sat perfectly still, staring at the silver pen, knowing that the absolute greatest performance of my life was about to end, and their absolute worst nightmare was about to begin. The heavy silver pen lay perfectly still on the pristine white tablecloth. It reflected the bright light from the crystal chandelier above us. I stared at the polished metal surface and felt a bitter wave of memories wash over me. I bought that exact pen for Christopher 20 years ago. I saved up 3 weeks of overtime pay from the machine shop just to afford it for his college graduation. I had it engraved with his initials, hoping he would use it to sign important, honest contracts and build a respectable life. Now my own son was pushing that same gift into my hands, forcing me to sign away my freedom, my home, and my sanity. The silence in the formal dining room was suffocating. All four of them were holding their breath, waiting for the broken old man to finally surrender. Paul and Diane leaned forward in their chairs. Their eyes were fixed on the thick stack of legal documents with undisguised ravenous greed. They were practically salivating at the thought of liquidating my estate to fund their new wealthy lifestyle. Megan stood near the kitchen doorway, clutching a bottle of expensive red wine. A smug, triumphant smile slowly spread across her face. She was entirely convinced that her plan had worked flawlessly. She thought the lethal antipsychotics had completely melted my brain, making me nothing more than an obedient shell. Dr. Evans sat across from me with his hands folded neatly on top of the mahogany table. He tapped his index finger against the wood in a slow, rhythmic motion. He was completely detached from the profound human tragedy happening right in front of him. He was just waiting for the ink to dry so he could collect the second half of his illegal blood money and disappear into the night. Christopher remained standing right beside my chair, leaning down so his face was level with mine. I could smell the expensive cologne he wore mixed with the nervous sweat beading on his forehead. His desperation was palpable. He needed this financial bailout tonight, or his hidden creditors would absolutely destroy him by Monday morning. He whispered my name again, his voice dripping with cold, calculated menace. He told me to stop staring blankly and pick up the pen. He repeated his threat that if I did not sign the power of attorney right now, the state authorities would drag me out of my own house and lock me in a padded cell forever. I kept my head bowed low, letting my jaw hang slack for just a few more seconds. I let my right hand tremble violently as I slowly reached out across the table. I brushed my calloused fingertips against the cold silver metal of the pen. Megan let out a soft, breathless laugh of pure victory from the doorway. She poured herself a full glass of wine, already silently toasting to my demise. Paul nudged Diane and muttered that it was finally over, and they could start packing my things into garbage bags tomorrow morning. I wrapped my trembling fingers around the heavy silver barrel of the pen. I slowly lifted it off the tablecloth, feeling the familiar weight of the metal in my grip. I brought the tip of the pen hovering just an inch above the signature line on the fraudulent medical surrender form. Christopher let out a long, heavy sigh of profound relief. He stood up straight and adjusted his tailored suit jacket, believing his massive debts were officially erased. But I did not lower the pen to the paper. I stopped trembling. The violent shaking in my right hand ceased entirely. I slowly lifted my head and closed my jaw. I felt the muscles in my face harden as I completely dropped the illusion of the confused, dying victim. I turned my neck and looked directly up into the eyes of my son. Christopher froze. The arrogant relief vanished from his face in an instant, replaced by a sudden creeping confusion. He looked into my eyes and saw absolutely zero trace of the heavy sedatives they had tried to feed me. He saw no brain decay and no cognitive decline. He only saw the sharp, focused wrath of a father who had survived the slaughterhouse. I did not say a single word to him. I brought my left hand up from my lap and gripped the other end of the silver pen. You do not spend 40 years bending steel and grinding iron without developing a crushing physical grip. I braced my elbows against the edge of the mahogany table. I stared dead into his terrified eyes and applied a sudden violent pressure to the center of the metal barrel. The heavy silver pen snapped completely in half with a loud, sharp crack that echoed like a gunshot in the silent dining room. The sudden noise shattered the arrogant peace of the room. Megan dropped her wine glass. It hit the hardwood floor and shattered into a dozen pieces, sending dark red liquid splashing across the baseboards. Paul and Diane leaped back in their chairs, their faces turning completely pale. Dr. Evans jumped slightly, dropping his professional facade as he stared at the broken pieces of metal resting in my hands. I tossed the two jagged halves of the ruined pen onto the fraudulent legal documents. They clattered against the table, completely ruining the pristine white paper. The realization hit Christopher like a physical blow to the stomach. He realized in that exact second that I was perfectly lucid. He realized I had not swallowed a single drop of the poison they had prepared for me. He realized I had been listening to every single word they said and acting out a prolonged, humiliating charade right under his nose. The sudden total loss of his financial salvation, combined with the terrifying truth of my deception, broke his mind entirely. Christopher erupted in an explosive, blind rage. His face turned a deep, violent shade of crimson, and the veins in his neck bulged against his collar. He let out a furious, animalistic roar and lunged forward, closing the distance between us in a fraction of a second. He reached out with both hands, aiming to grab me violently by the collar of my flannel shirt, to physically force me back down into the chair. His hands were just inches away from my chest. I braced my boots against the floor, ready to fight back. But before his fingers could even graze the fabric of my shirt, a loud, heavy sound cut through the chaos of the dining room. The heavy brass front doorbell chimed twice, echoing clearly through the entire house. The heavy brass chime of the front doorbell hung in the air, cutting through the suffocating tension of the dining room. Christopher froze entirely. His hands were suspended just inches away from the collar of my flannel shirt. The violent crimson rage that had consumed his face only a fraction of a second earlier was suddenly replaced by a sharp, paralyzing confusion. He kept his eyes locked on me, his chest heaving with heavy, erratic breaths. No one moved. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, trapped in a bizarre state of suspended animation. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked away the seconds, amplifying the profound, dead silence that had fallen over the grand mahogany table. Megan was the first to break the stillness. She let out a nervous, shaky breath and looked toward the arched doorway leading to the foyer. She whispered that they were not expecting any guests and asked Christopher who could possibly be visiting at this hour of the night. Christopher slowly lowered his hands, pulling them away from my chest. He straightened his tailored suit jacket and wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. He forced a tight, artificial composure back onto his features, trying desperately to regain control of the room. He told Megan to ignore the door. He insisted it was probably just a neighborhood solicitor or a confused delivery driver who had the wrong address. He said they were in the middle of a critical medical transition, and absolutely nothing was going to interrupt them. He turned his attention back to me, ready to resume his aggressive intimidation. But before he could even open his mouth to speak, the doorbell chimed again. This time it was not just a polite electronic tone. It was immediately followed by 4 loud, heavy strikes of a closed fist against the solid oak wood of my front door. It was not the hesitant knock of a lost delivery driver. It was the rhythmic, authoritative pounding of law enforcement. It was the sound of a consequence demanding immediate entry. Dr. Evans shifted uncomfortably in his chair across the table. His professional detachment was rapidly evaporating. He instinctively reached out and placed his hands flat over the fraudulent medical documents and the forged power of attorney, completely covering the papers, as if he could hide his criminal extortion from whoever was standing on the porch. He looked up at Christopher with wide, panicked eyes and whispered that he could not afford to be associated with any public disturbances. He said his medical license was already under review, and he demanded that Christopher resolve the situation at the door immediately before things escalated. Christopher clenched his jaw, his face contorting with a mixture of immense frustration and rising terror. He pointed a trembling finger at Megan and ordered her to go to the front door. He told her to crack it open just an inch and tell whoever was out there to leave the property at once. He instructed her to say there was a severe illness in the family and that they were legally demanding absolute privacy. Megan nodded, her face drained of all color. She stepped carefully over the shattered glass of her wine glass and hurried out of the dining room. I remained sitting perfectly still in my heavy armchair at the head of the table. I did not slouch. I did not let my jaw hang slack. I sat up perfectly straight, resting my strong, steady hands on the arms of the chair. I watched the remaining 3 predators squirm in the suffocating quiet. Paul and Diane had completely lost their arrogant smirks. Paul slowly put down his silver fork, his eyes darting nervously toward the foyer. Diane reached up and nervously fingered the pearls around her neck, looking like a trespasser who had just heard the security alarm trigger. From the front hallway, I heard the heavy deadbolt slide open. I heard Megan ask in a high-pitched, trembling voice who was there and how she could help them. There was no polite greeting in response. I heard the unmistakable heavy sound of a solid wood door being pushed forcefully open against resistance. I heard the synchronized thud of heavy tactical boots stepping deliberately onto the polished hardwood floor of my foyer. Megan let out a soft, terrified gasp, and her footsteps retreated rapidly backward toward the dining room. She backed through this arched doorway, trembling uncontrollably. She did not say a word. She simply moved out of the way, pressing herself flat against the floral wallpaper. Arthur Reynolds stepped into the dining room. My attorney looked immaculate and absolutely terrifying. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that radiated immense corporate power, and his sharp, calculating eyes swept across the room with profound, unadulterated contempt. He stepped onto the expensive oriental rug without looking down, completely dominating the space with his sheer presence. But it was not just the ruthless lawyer that made the air vanish from the room. Flanking Arthur on either side, stepping into the dining room with absolute grim authority, were 2 massive uniformed police officers. Their utility belts clinked softly in the quiet room, and their hands rested cautiously near their radios. They stood tall and imposing, forming an impenetrable wall of law enforcement right inside my home. The room froze in absolute suffocating shock. The visual contrast was jarring. The dining room was set with my late wife's delicate gold-rimmed china and flickering candlelight, presenting the illusion of a perfect, wealthy family gathering. But the grim reality of the police officers shattered that illusion into a million irreparable pieces. Christopher stepped back from my chair, his hands raised slightly in the air in a defensive posture. His mind was struggling to process the catastrophic collapse of his flawless plan. He tried to puff out his chest and project the authority of a homeowner. He demanded to know who these men were and why they were unlawfully invading a private residence. He stammered that they were in the middle of a highly sensitive medical evaluation for his severely ill father, and that this intrusion was causing me immense psychological distress. He pointed a shaking finger at me, playing the role of the protective son one final desperate time. Arthur Reynolds ignored Christopher entirely. He did not even acknowledge my son's existence. Arthur walked straight past the trembling younger man and approached the head of the table. He looked down at me, his sharp expression softening into a look of deep professional respect. He asked me in a clear, calm voice if I was unharmed and if I was ready to proceed. I looked up at my attorney, and for the first time in 48 hours, I spoke in my true, normal voice. I did not slur my syllables. I did not whisper or mumble. My voice was deep, resonant, and utterly unwavering. I told Arthur that I was perfectly unharmed and that his timing was absolutely impeccable. The sound of my clear, articulate voice hit the room like a physical shockwave. Megan let out a choked, sobbing gasp and covered her mouth with both hands. Paul literally dropped his wine glass onto the table, spilling dark red liquid across the pristine white cloth. Dr. Evans shrank back into his chair, his face turning the color of ash, as he realized the old man he was planning to chemically lobotomize was entirely lucid. Christopher looked as though the floor had completely dropped out from beneath his feet. His eyes were wide with a terror so profound it almost looked like physical pain. He realized in that exact second that I had orchestrated every single moment of his downfall. Christopher opened his mouth to speak, to formulate some kind of lie or excuse, but Arthur Reynolds did not give him the chance. Arthur turned his cold, calculating gaze onto my son and systematically dismantled his authority. He stated in a loud, commanding tone that he was the absolute legal representative of this estate, and that the men in uniform were here to secure a major crime scene. Christopher tried to argue, sputtering, that he was the medical power of attorney and that I was completely incapable of hiring a lawyer. Arthur reached into the interior pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a thick, heavy legal folder. The stark white paper was bound together and stamped with a massive, undeniable red seal across the front cover. Arthur stepped forward and slammed the red-stamped legal folder directly onto the center of Christopher's dining plate, completely crushing the expensive roasted meat and shattering the delicate gold-rimmed china beneath it. Looking back on this entire nightmare, I realized the most difficult truth a parent can ever face. Blood does not automatically grant someone the right to abuse you. We spend our entire lives sacrificing our bodies and our bank accounts to protect our children, assuming that love will be naturally returned to us when we grow old and vulnerable. But true family is built entirely on mutual respect and genuine care, not on arrogant entitlement and greedy expectations. I learned that you must protect your own peace and your own dignity at absolutely all costs, even if it means walking away from the very people you raised. Kindness is a beautiful thing, but when someone mistakes your kindness for weakness, you have to show them exactly how strong you truly are. Thank you so much for listening to my story tonight. If you found any value in my journey, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your own experiences in the comments below.